Imagine being a teenager and having the Prime Minister seriously considering banning you from Instagram, TikTok and Snapchat. Not because you've done anything wrong, but because the government has decided that social media is too dangerous for anyone under 16. That's exactly what Keir Starmer is now contemplating, and it represents yet another spectacular U-turn from a government that seems to change its mind more often than most people change their socks. The man who previously opposed a social media ban is now saying all options are on the table, and the political gymnastics required to justify this flip-flop are absolutely extraordinary to witness. Quick favor, if you're finding this fascinating, hit that subscribe button and click the bell icon. Over 94% of you watching haven't subscribed yet. It's completely free, takes 1 second, and genuinely helps us keep making this content. Cheers if you did. Right, back to Labour's latest policy somersault. So let's break down what's actually happening here, because this story has more twists than a political thriller. Sir Keir Starmer has given the clearest indication yet that Labour is considering a ban on under-16s using social media, in what would mark another significant government U-turn. Now, the phrase "another significant U-turn" is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence, because this government has already performed more U-turns than a learner driver in a cul-de-sac. We've had U-turns on the winter fuel payment, U-turns on tax policy, U-turns on pretty much everything they said during the election campaign. And now we're potentially getting a U-turn on social media policy. The Prime Minister told reporters that he has not ruled out introducing an Australia-style ban on young people using social media, following pressure from his backbenchers. He added, "All options are on the table." All options are on the table is political speak for "we haven't decided what we're doing yet, but we want to sound like we're taking this seriously." It's the policy equivalent of a vague answer on a job application where you haven't actually done the research, but you're trying to sound competent anyway. Here's the kicker, though. This comes despite Sir Keir previously opposing such a ban. So we've got a Prime Minister who was against something before he was potentially for it, which is exactly the kind of principled leadership that inspires confidence in voters. To be fair to Starmer, politicians are allowed to change their minds when presented with new evidence or circumstances, but when you're changing your mind on major policy positions every few weeks, it starts to look less like thoughtful reconsideration and more like panicked flailing in response to political pressure. And where's that political pressure coming from? Well, partly from Kemi Badenoch, who has vowed that the Conservatives would block under-16s from social media if they win the next election. So now we've got both major parties potentially backing the same policy, which should tell you something about the political winds on this issue. When both Labour and the Tories agree on something, it's usually either genuinely important or politically irresistible. And in this case, it's probably a bit of both. The pressure is mounting on the government to follow Australia, which became the first country to ban social media for young people last month. Australia's always been something of a pioneer when it comes to bold, slightly authoritarian-sounding policies. They've got strict gun laws, they've got mandatory voting, and now they've got a social media ban for kids. Whether that makes them forward-thinking or overly paternalistic depends on your perspective, but there's no denying that their decision has put pressure on other countries to follow suit. Now let's talk about West Streeting, because the Health Secretary has become one of the most vocal advocates for action on this issue. Streeting is calling for action on children using social media over concerns that it is harming the life chances of young people. He warned that the technology has been unleashed without properly understanding the consequences, and when asked if he backed a ban for under-16s, Streeting told Sky News, "I'm certainly in favour of action in this area." Streeting's got a point, to be fair. Social media has been unleashed on society with relatively little consideration for the long-term psychological and social consequences, particularly for young people whose brains are still developing. We're essentially conducting a massive, uncontrolled experiment on an entire generation, and the early results are not particularly encouraging. Rising rates of anxiety, depression, body image issues, cyberbullying, the list goes on. Whether a blanket ban is the right solution is a different question, but Streeting's concern about the impact on young people is entirely legitimate. This is all expected to come to a head next week because the House of Lords is due to vote on a Tory amendment to the Children's Wellbeing in Schools Bill that would prevent under-16s from accessing social media. If it passes, a Commons showdown would follow, and Labour MPs have been urged not to rebel and back the amendment, which is absolutely fascinating, right? Because it suggests that there's significant support among Labour backbenchers for this ban, to the point that the leadership is worried about a rebellion. That's putting enormous pressure on Starmer to get ahead of the issue by announcing his own version of the policy before his MPs force his hand. After indicating earlier this week that he was open to reconsidering his opposition, Sir Keir said today, "We need to better protect children from social media. We are looking at what is happening in Australia, but all options are on the table in relation to what further protections we can put in place, whether that is under-16s on social media, all options on the table." He really loves that phrase, all options on the table. It's become his go-to response for any difficult policy question. What about the economy? All options on the table. What about immigration? All options on the table. What about your sandwich order for lunch? All options on the table, mate. And in theory, using social media to communicate government work makes sense. We live in a digital age. People consume information on these platforms. Transparency about enforcement activities could theoretically build public confidence, but there is a massive gap between theory and execution. What the government has actually created is a piece of content so tone-deaf, so obviously performative, that it has become a lightning rod for mockery. The dramatic music, the action movie editing, the whole vibe of it screams, trying too hard. It feels like when your dad tries to use youth slang and somehow makes everything infinitely more awkward. How do you do, fellow border security enthusiasts? It is the governmental equivalent of that. And here is the truly delicious irony in all of this. The government launched this TikTok account presumably to control the narrative around migration and border security. They wanted to show strength, competence, results. Instead, they have handed their critics an absolute gift. They have created a focal point for every joke, every criticism, every ounce of skepticism about their migration policies. The comment section of that lone video has become a digital town square where the British public is exercising its God-given right to take the absolute piss out of authority figures who have made themselves look silly. The question we must ask is, what were they thinking? Did nobody in the entire chain of approval for this project raise their hand and say, hang on, might this come across as a bit daft? Was there no moment of reflection where someone thought perhaps a social media account is not the solution to a complex humanitarian and political crisis? The fact that this made it through multiple levels of government bureaucracy and political oversight without anyone pumping the brakes is genuinely fascinating from a decision-making perspective. You also have to spare a thought for the poor social media manager who has been assigned to run this account. Imagine that job description. Wanted, social media expert to make illegal immigration enforcement engaging and shareable. Must be comfortable with constant mockery and single-digit engagement rates. Thick skin essential. Apply within. That person is currently living through what can only be described as a professional nightmare. They are the face of one of the most ridiculed government initiatives in recent memory, and they have to keep posting through it all with a stiff upper lip. What makes this entire situation even more absurd is the timing. We are in January 2026. TikTok is hardly new or cutting edge anymore. If the government had launched this 5 years ago, it might have seemed innovative, ahead of the curve. But now it just looks like everyone finally caught up to what young people were doing in 2019 and decided to copy it without understanding why it worked in the first place. It is the policy equivalent of your mum finally getting Snapchat just as everyone has moved on to the next thing. The broader context here matters too. This is not happening in a vacuum. The UK has been grappling with migration issues for years. The small boats crisis has dominated headlines. Different governments have tried different approaches, from the Rwanda scheme to increased channel patrols to international agreements. Some of these approaches have been more successful than others. Some have been controversial. Some have been legally challenged. But what they all had in common was that they were actual policy interventions, not marketing exercises. That is ultimately what makes this TikTok account so frustrating for people across the political spectrum. It feels like style over substance. It feels like the government is more concerned about appearing to do something than actually doing something effective. And when you combine that perception with the fact that the execution has been so spectacularly poor that even the attempt to appear effective has failed, you end up with this perfect storm of ridicule. The deeper issue is trust. When governments resort to what look like gimmicks, it erodes public trust in their ability to handle serious issues. People want to believe their leaders are focused on solving problems, not on getting followers and engagement metrics. They want policy, not performance. They want results, not reels. And when those two things get confused, when the communication strategy becomes more prominent than the actual strategy,